I want to begin by thanking Pam and Anna for inviting me here today. It's my distinct honor and privilege to do this presentation on land acknowledgements for you. Also want to thank everyone out there in Zoom land for being here this morning. I appreciate you making time for this. So, okay, to begin. My work on developing land acknowledgement primarily is out of my experience working with the Hurt Museum. About 4 years ago, I was invited to join the Board of Trustees Program Committee. The program committee deals with the issues surrounding the museum's exhibits, its publications, its educational outreach, things of that nature. And so it's a good example, I would say, of how the pursuit or the interest in developing a land acknowledgement occurs in a lot of places. More to the point, often, as was the case at the Hurt Museum, somebody, suddenly realizes that this land acknowledgement movement is going on, and it becomes important to them. And so because of my affiliation with the Hertz Program Committee, I got to work, among other people, with these two women here. On the right is Beth Murphy, and on the left is Norma Jean Coultier. They're both Board of Trustees, and they're both members of the Program Committee, of which I'm a member. And so I want to credit in particular Beth on the right-hand side for being the person to bring the land acknowledgement issue to the Herd and this committee. She and some other Board of Trustees members, fall of 2019 or late summer 2019, they went on a museum trip in the upper Midwest. And so they were in Minneapolis and they were in Chicago. And so one of the things that they did was they went to this exhibit here, Hearts of Our People, Native Women Artists, which is hosted, as you can see, by the Minneapolis Institute of Art. And so it was because of going to this exhibit, going to the public events, that Beth experienced firsthand a major art institution, making a land acknowledgement. And so because of that moving experience, seeing the land of the Dakota and Ojibwe and Ho-Chunk acknowledged at this institute, she came back committed to making the land acknowledgement something that the Hurt Museum should do as well. So because I've been working with this committee for a while, because I'm Akimel O'odham, I'm enrolled in the Gila River Indian community. Plus, I'm a longtime American Indian Studies professor. As noted in my introduction, I do have a few publications out there. And so you may have noticed I have a book about Charles Eastman, Dakota Indian. The reason for that is because my career actually began at the University of Minnesota back in fall of 2000. And so that's simply to say that I've been in AIS a long time. My more recent book, I'm not sure if that part of the introduction was audible. I detected a technical glitch. Is called Life of the Indigenous Mind. It's Vine Deloria Jr. and the Birth of the Rep Power movement. And so all of this, my point is that all of this informs my understanding of the land acknowledgement issue and why it's important. So because of Beth Murphy's enthusiasm for creating a land acknowledgement for the Hurt Museum, she asked me to chair a subcommittee dedicated to composing a land acknowledgement. And so I readily agreed. Consequently, it was up to me to assemble the agenda. I had to explain the importance of land acknowledgements. I had to articulate all of the issues that are involved in developing such a document. It was my responsibility to lead all of the discussion and answer all of the questions and moderate all of the debates regarding this, as well as writing the draft and shepherding that draft through all of the approvals, not just at the museum level, but at the community level as well. So, okay, pardon me. So when it comes to resources for developing a land acknowledgement, certainly nowadays, if you just Google the phrase "how to write a land acknowledgement," there's actually going to be a significant number of resources out there, that provide people guidance on how to not only structure the statement, but also how to develop the discussion. So the one that I selected, this is back in fall 2019, was produced by the United States Department of Arts and Cultures. Despite its official government sounding name, the USDAC is not a federal agency. It's a nonprofit coalition of Indigenous artists. And so I selected this particular resource, not necessarily because it was the best one out there. It wasn't like I was sampling all kinds of resources and determined that this was the best one, but I was acquainted with the artists that are involved with this group. Because it's made up of Indigenous artists, and I was leading this committee on behalf of an art museum, the Hurt Museum. I thought that this particular resource would suit our needs. And so this organization, the U.S. Department of Arts and Cultures, they have, and it's free, of course, they have this how-to guide on developing your land acknowledgement, which they've titled Honor Native Land. It's just 13 pages long, so it's not a lengthy read, and it's easy to use. And as you can see on the right-hand side in the table of contents, they've divided the process into 3 easy to comprehend steps, beginning with what is land acknowledgement. Certainly any organization or group of people wanting to pursue this should have some idea of what it is that they're doing. And then there's the how to acknowledge. And so language is important, especially when you're talking about how, say, a settler colonial institution like a museum is going to be communicating its acknowledgement to Indigenous people, more specifically Indigenous nations. And then what is also encouraged, which is equally important, is that, well, once you have your acknowledgement, what do you do next? And the assumption here is that the land acknowledgement, as important as it is as a statement of that institution, should be a first step towards something bigger and more meaningful, as a result of this statement. It's like, what are you committing yourself to? So when it comes to what a land acknowledgement is, my committee began with this discussion here in the first paragraph, where it states, acknowledgement by itself is a small gesture. It becomes meaningful when coupled with authentic relationships and informed action. But this beginning can be an opening to greater public consciousness of Native sovereignty and cultural rights, a step toward equitable relationship and reconciliation. Join us in adopting, calling for, and spreading this practice. And so, as you can tell by this language, these artists, these activist artists that compose this how-to guide, they want land acknowledgements to be deep, meaningful, substantive statements. They want these statements issued by these institutions to be transformative. In other words, they do not want them to just be what one of my colleagues called performative. It'll be more than just a cordial gesture, more than just a how do you do, we're glad to see it, right? And so, it's just like, well, what, and this was part of our discussion, what makes a land acknowledgement, what makes this movement to get more and more institutions to do these land acknowledgements, so meaningful? In other words, why has it become a thing? At a superficial level, the land acknowledgement movement parallels, another important movement, which is the Indigenous Peoples Day movement. Many of you, probably all of you, are aware that many municipalities, including Phoenix, have officially established Independence Day. It should be our Independence Day, Indigenous Peoples Day, in lieu of Columbus Day. And so if you didn't know any better, so what's my point? If you didn't know any better, you might think that land acknowledgement, just like Indigenous Peoples Day, is some kind of social trend. It's just something that is reflective of the attitudes and feelings of a certain generation. And like any other social trend, it'll eventually pass. But from, I would say, a Native point of view, if I can put it that way, land acknowledgement actually has a deep historic roots. It's not just a recent social trend. It's actually a new expression of a very old idea. So where does this idea of land acknowledgement come from? I would say many would argue that the first land acknowledgements, occurred in the numerous treaties that the United States made with hundreds of indigenous nations from the beginning of the American Republic all the way through 1871, when treaty making was ended by Congress. Obviously, other nations engaged in treaty making with their First Nations. My orientation to this process is through U.S. tribal relations. And so what I have on my screen here are two examples of treaties. You got, let's see what I have here. You got Cherokee on the right-hand side and Choctaw on the left-hand side. So these are lengthy documents, so I'm not going to be reading these with you. I just want to draw to your attention. Hopefully you can see the fine print that there is a land acknowledgement statement embedded in the middle of each one of these. On the Choctaw Treaty on the left-hand side, you'll see in Article 3, a statement that begins the boundary of the lands. And they have a similar statement in Article 4 of the Cherokee Treaty, the boundary. Let's see, the boundary, I can't read that, but it says the boundary, of these lands, belong to the Cherokee. And so from an Indigenous point of view, land acknowledgement, is connected to this treaty making tradition. Obviously, not every Indigenous people in the US, for example, has the treaty with the United States. Nonetheless, in some form or another, particularly if we're talking about federally acknowledged tribes, there is going to be some statement, might be in an executive order, for example, in which the federal government is going to acknowledge that certain lands belong to your nation, your people. So as I'm sure you're also aware by this example of treaty making, that these documents also include the lands that the tribes in question, in this case Choctaw and Cherokee, were compelled to give up to the United States. And so the boundary of a given reservation is usually preceded by an articulation of the lands that that nation agreed through treaty to surrender to the United States. So what we're talking about, of course, is colonization. And so land acknowledgement, as indigenous idea, is about getting not just the federal government, but everyone and everything that has benefited from what the federal government has done to indigenous land to acknowledge that this land historically, ancestrally, indigenously, belongs to the first people. in the plural, First Peoples, right? So with respect to the current trend, to put it that way, in land acknowledgement statements, a lot of communities, a lot of Indigenous nations have been inspired by the Truth and Reconciliation movement that is still going on up in Canada. It's been going on for a good 20, 30 years. And so you have an example of the intensity, the poignancy of that movement for Canadian First Nations. You know, it's something that is worth organizing a public protest about, asserting treaty rights, you know, reminding a settler colonial nation like Canada of its responsibilities, its ethical responsibilities, truth and healing to First People. And then on the right-hand side, you know, you have a demonstration, an expression of how emotionally intense this movement is and the issues associated with this. You know, because what your institution is also acknowledging, you know, when it makes that land acknowledgement statement, you know, it's not just a recognition of property rights. You know, that would be a very crass American way of putting it. It's a ethical statement on the part of
you're the right person grant authorization to access the link to look at the request information. So every time
everybody, will you please?
Okay, I thought somebody was trying hard to interject a question, so I stopped. Anyway, to continue, I would say that from once again from a Native perspective, you know, getting institutions to issue land acknowledgements statements is more than just a recognition of legal rights to the land or property rights to the land. It's about getting institutions to realize that these institutions, in my case, getting the Hurt Museum to realize that the reason why that they're on the land that they're on now is because they benefited, however indirectly it may be, they benefited from their predecessors, the Americans, you know, from 100 years ago, coming in, settling, occupying, and taking political control of the land that is now Phoenix, Arizona. And so that museum, you know, is able to thrive in its current location, similar to other institutions are able to thrive in their current locations because of what federal Indian policy made possible for them, right? So the land acknowledgement statement is more than just historical. It's more than just diplomacy. You know, it's about healing. It's also about healing, and maybe even about justice, right? So with all of that in mind, I had to set an agenda for my committee. And this is where, you know, any group of people, in this case, my committee, I think it was about 10 of us, you know, get into the nitty gritty of the issues. In particular, this is where a lot of truth telling occurs, because anybody who's been part of any committee work knows that once you're behind closed doors, you know, there's a freedom, a candor that starts to emerge, which is an important part of the process. So the agenda that I set for my committee, trying to develop the statement for the herd is, well, we had to answer these basic questions, you know, such as who is to be acknowledged, you know, what nations are you talking about, you know, which land, you know, and what's the historic scope. And historic scope is very, very, very important, which I'll get to in a moment. They have to consider the purpose of the statement. You know, once again, is this just a formality? Is your institution only trying to enhance its image? Or does it want to do something more serious and meaningful, such as engage in atonement for the actions that your nation, your settlement colonial nation committed against Indigenous people that got the land? You know, are you wanting to pursue reconciliation, relationship building, and so forth? And then there's futuring, which is, you know, what are the next steps beyond the statement? What are your aspirational goals? You know, you should set a new agenda for your institution. And you should also consider, you know, what you're willing to give back. You really need to get your institution to think about what is it that you're willing to give back. You know, it could be in terms of resources, say funding programming or scholarships or something that the community needs. Are you willing, depending on the institution, are you willing to give land back? Because if you're going to acknowledge that where you're at, you know, is Indigenous land, you know, and that land was acquired, expropriated, you know, out of the control of Indigenous people. And if you're aware of your history and you think that what happened to the Indigenous people that you're acknowledging, you know, was wrong, was a historic wrong, you know, what can your institution do to right things, you know, to rectify things? So obviously with these kind of questions, you know, people's sensitivities started to come out. I did encounter committee members who, because they have been looking at other land acknowledgement examples with me from different parts of the US and even some from Canada, they did see examples of institutions bearing their souls, you might say, and acknowledging that what happened to the Indigenous peoples in their area was nothing short of genocide. And so in these statements, those institutions felt obliged to acknowledge that that historical trauma. And they wanted to make it part of their mission, their new vision of themselves. However, whereas there were some committee members, you know, who were amenable to being that honest about history, there were others who were much more reluctant and didn't see why we needed to go that direction. And so it's incumbent on me to try to mediate that discussion. And so what it usually involved on my part, and this is where my experience as an AIS professor comes in, I would give them, well, not to sound didactic about it, but I provide a historical overview. So basically a lecture in American Indian history and Indian white relations. When it came to, you know, future relations with Indigenous people, you know, some were skeptical about doing that, you know, because when it comes to what can your institution give back, there were people who were a little apprehensive that once the acknowledgement is made, that this becomes leverage on the part of Indigenous nations to get things out of the museum, you know, that maybe the museum does not want to give up, be it land or resources or that sort of thing. And so you have to moderate discussions about people being fearful of what the statement might lead to. So there's going to be a lot of apprehension about what the unforeseen consequences might be. Right? So, okay, when it comes to the discussion that we had about where we're at, given that we're talking about the Hurt Museum, I thought that it was a no-brainer that the Hurt Museum, which is located on Central Avenue in downtown Phoenix, that was a no-brainer that we're talking about Akimel O'odham land. Because growing up, Akimel O'odham, visiting the Hurt Museum, you know, since I was a little boy, I had always understood this place to be our land. Yet, when it comes to developing that statement, and figuring out who it is that you're going to thank, this is where the historical scope, or even the land in question, becomes an issue. Because for starters, I had to ask my committee, ask the museum, well, what land are we talking about when we're talking about the hurt? Are we talking about only the Hurt Museum campus itself, which only encompasses so many acres? Are you picturing yourself as part of downtown Phoenix? The Phoenix Valley. How broad of a landscape, are you thinking about? When it comes to what it is you want to acknowledge, because that has implications, obviously, on which nations that you're going to acknowledge. So after some discussion, it was determined that the acknowledgement, the land to be acknowledged, is going to be the campus itself. I think it's about 13 acres in downtown. So I informed my colleagues on the committee that, well, if we're only talking about the Hurt Museum campus, then we're only talking about Akimel O'odham land. So I was asked, well, what about the Peeposh? Because after all, both Gila River and Salt River identify as Pima Maricopa. I said, well, when it comes to our community, we do in fact identify as Pima Maricopa or O'odham Peeposh. But culturally, historically, Peeposh lands, are elsewhere. They're farther west. And there's a part of the Scottsdale Tempe area where there's Peeposh land as well. But the majority of their land is in the West Valley. And so if we want to get specific, and if we're talking about the campus, we are getting specific, then we're talking about Akimel O'odham land. But then there was other questions about the historical scope. Before I get into which, I want to point out, I forgot I had these maps. The Hurt Museum is up here. So this is downtown Phoenix near Good Samaritan Hospital. Here's the Salt River right here. And then here's Pueblo Grande Archaeological Museum, which is a O'odham site. And so what you have over here in turn, I should mention it as well, it's actually a very good resource. It's nativeland.ca. It's a Canadian organization that put this together. It's very handy if you're not sure where your institution is located. And so it has a search engine. And what you do is you punch in the location of your institution. And so what I have here is the street address for the Hurt Museum. And so what resulted was this map here, where the green box is the Hurt Museum itself, and information that the Hurt Museum is in the middle of the O'odham Jebit, which is my people's homeland. So this resource confirms, my claim to my colleagues that the Hurt Museum is in the middle of the O'odham Jebit, is in the middle of Akimel O'odham homeland. Nonetheless, I got questions, and if you're working on these things too, you may get questions as well about the history of the land itself. You may get questions about, in this case, have the O'odham been the only people to ever occupy this land? I got questions about the O'odham. I said, well, the O'odham, they're our ancestors. I mean, O'odham is an O'odham word for ancestors. It literally means those who have gone away. But that's our phrasing, for our predecessors, our ancestors. Archaeologists took that term, of course, and turned it into a historic category associated exclusively with the people who built the big houses, such as Casa Grande ruins. So in developing this land acknowledgement statement, I had to inform my colleagues, and they were willing to listen, what the history of the land is. And so with that in mind, I was asked about the Hopi. Should the Hopi be acknowledged? I said, well, the Hopi were down here, ancestral Hopi were down here. They were down here, I think, about 1,000 years ago. Just as there's oral tradition saying that my ancestors, the Hugam, were up in Hopi country, and Hopi well acknowledged that as well. And so if your focus or one of the foci of your land acknowledgement statement is to be as comprehensive historically as possible, then you well have to take into consideration that the land on which your institution sits, does encompass previous generations of Indigenous people, some of whom may have different ethnic identities than the ones that were on the land, when the Americans showed up, right? So speaking of which, when it came to developing the statement and keeping in mind, the political and ethical importance of the statement to communities like mine, what I impressed upon my colleagues, my co-committee members, when it came to, well, what should we think about? I said that if this statement is going to have any substance and any meaning, if it's going to be as transformative as this thing should be, then one of three things that we need to think about when it comes to pardon me, when it comes to who is the audience for this statement. In my opinion, given what we're talking about, the Hurt Museum, where we're talking about, which is in downtown Phoenix, which is in the middle of the O'odham Jevit, then what this committee, this museum needs to remember is that this statement is the Hurt Museum making the statement to us. And that's important to point out, because a part of my experience in working on this, I have really great colleagues. I want to underscore that. And they were quite earnest about doing a good job, doing a sincere job with developing this statement. However, a peculiar consequence of my role as committee chair, my identity as O'odham, is that sometimes I think people forgot whose statement this was supposed to be for. Sometimes I think people regarded the statement that I was helping develop as a statement from the O'odham to the museum, when in fact it's supposed to be the other way around. So with that in mind, I asked my museum colleagues to think about when did the Americans arrive, and what happened, once they arrived. In other words, who was on the land when the Americans arrived? And so history records that the land on which the Hurt stands was inhabited, by my ancestors, by my O'odham ancestors, and nobody else. So when the Americans started taking control of what today is Phoenix, Arizona, it was my ancestors during the 1860s, 1870s, and so on, who were impacted severely by the occupation of O'odham land. And so in light of that history, I asked my colleagues to think about, well, how did your institution, Hurt Museum, acquire the land that it's now on, and how does it fit into the history of colonization? Asking my colleagues do consider that was also a sensitive issue. And as a matter of fact, the archivist for the museum was asked to research how the Hurt Museum, the property that the Hurt Museum is on, was acquired in the first place. And so the archivist did find documentation, and it was documented that it was a legal land transaction. And so the sensitivity there was in the way that information was shared with me and others. The archivist expressed a lot of relief that according to the documentation that he found, that it wasn't the case that the Hurt family came in, like Oklahoma Sooners, and seized the land, out of Indian hands. It wasn't wrenched out of O'odham hands. The land was bought well after Arizona became a state, and the city of Phoenix had been established as the capital of Arizona. So as far as the Hurt Museum, was concerned, it's from their point of view, they didn't see how their institution was a part of colonial history. They didn't see how they were occupying stolen land. When any person says that land is stolen, we all know what that means. We all know the history behind that phrase. When it comes to institutions that you work for or work with, you're going to find that you're going to have to enlighten them about that difference in worldview, why you're certain, why you know that land was stolen, and why they need to think, why your institution needs to think about how its legal land transaction is actually a legal purchase of stolen property. So be prepared for pushback from members of your own institution who question the implications of taking the Indigenous point of view on history. There's going to be a lot of concern about the institution's image. They're going to be concerned about liability. When I was shepherding the draft that we had through the approval process, there was an attorney on one of the committees that asked me, when you say that the Hurt Museum is on Akimel O'odham land, does this coincide with what the Indian Land Claims Commission determined was O'odham land? When Gila River, brought its suit, into the Indian Lands Claim Commission. And I told the attorneys that I have no idea, because my assertion that the museum is on O'odham land is based on oral tradition, is based on what I know of O'odham history, is not based on what the federal government says is O'odham land. So you're going to get a lot of pushback, on issues like that, because people are going to be concerned that any statement that you compose is going to have legal implications. So you have to be ready for those kind of questions, right? So, okay. Nonetheless, you want to keep the community, the Indigenous community, in the loop, involved in what you're doing. Hopefully, like the Herd, your institution has Indigenous people working for it or with it. In that program committee that I mentioned, there are other Indigenous people who are committee members. There is Indigenous members of the Board of Trustees at the Herd. I'm only one of two O'odham that are affiliated with the museum. And so hence my role in chairing the committee. Nonetheless, even when you have representatives of the Indigenous nations in question involved with your institution, such as I was with the Herd, you still want to get the community involved. And so what that meant, and this was at my strong recommendation, what this meant with respect to the Herd's draft is I wanted us to go to a meeting of the 4 Southern tribes with this draft to present it to them, and get feedback from them. So there's two types of meeting. I should point out that the four Southern tribes are the four O'odham reservations in Arizona. So Salt River, Gila River, Akshin, and Thorn O'odham Nation. On a monthly basis, the cultural resource and tribal historical preservation people will have monthly meetings. And at these meetings, organizations like the Herd, organizations like my committee, can ask to be put on the agenda to present things like land acknowledgements and ideas for developing the land acknowledgement or developing the museum's agenda can be presented. So I had worked with this group multiple times. And so you can see some of the names associated with this group, all representative of the four O'odham communities. So I've done work with the archaeology program here at ASU. And so I've presented before the four Southern tribes before. So that's how I know about this. So because I know the people who go to these meetings and I've worked with them before, I told my colleagues, I said, we got to get on this agenda. So we did. So we did. It was very easy to do. And I'm grateful for the friends that I have at these meetings for accommodating us. Still, as we prepare to go in, despite my role in this process, despite the fact that the Board of Trustees, all the member is Governor Stephen Lewis of Gila River, I forewarned my colleagues that when we go into these meetings, when we go into this meeting, don't expect the people there to be, really anxious and excited to be a part of this. It's just like the people we're going to be talking to, they're going to be very aware, as it says in my slide, very aware and very knowledgeable about what Phoenix, Arizona, and the United States did to colonize all of them land and people. So with that deep historical knowledge in mind, we need to expect, and we did encounter, tribal representatives at this meeting, to be cautious, to ask hard questions, and to challenge our sincerity. I said, don't assume that just because I'm there that, things are going to be all kumbaya, far from it. So we made a presentation. David Roach, the director of the Herd Museum, presented with me. And so we shared our drafted land acknowledgement and we opened the floor to questions, and we got a lot of feedback, and it was pretty intense. What I have highlighted here were the issues that the four Southern tribes brought up on our February 19th meeting, 2021. So it's just a few months ago, earlier this year. The thing about, I should add before I explain these items here, the thing about taking your draft to the community or the communities is that despite how thorough of a job you may think you have done on your own draft, no matter how many meetings and discussions you had about this draft, no matter how much you've convinced yourself that you've covered all the bases, rest assured, when you take it to the community, they're going to come up with issues that you never thought of. And that's why it's important to do this, because they're going to be seeing things from their perspective, which is what you want to address in the first place. So the three main things that our original draft sparked in terms of discussion. One, I wasn't surprised about. The other two, caught me completely off guard. In the case of the first one, the original draft referred to the land that the herd sits on as Akimel O'odham Hachilam Pipash land, or Pima Maricopa land. The reason that I wrote it that way is I thought it would be prudent to acknowledge or to correspond our statement with the way in which Gila River and Salt River identify the communities, which is Pima Maricopa. as I noted earlier, I did point out to my colleagues that, the hurts on O'odham land and Maricopa land is farther to the west. But politically, I think it makes sense to say O'odham Pipash. So the person that took issue with this was Barnaby Lewis, who is the THPO for Gila River, very knowledgeable, well-respected elder. When he heard the statement read this way, he understood what I was trying to do. I did explain my word selection. But he said that if he was at the Hurt Museum and he heard the Hurt Museum official read that statement with this reference to all the Pipash land, it wouldn't sit right with him, because it's O'odham land. That campus is on O'odham land. So I said, I agree with you. I know that. And so if what I was intending to do is having a negative effect, then obviously I need to take that out. And in the revised draft, I did take that out. And it just says Akimel O'odham land. In the original draft as well, because I wanted her to acknowledge the history of colonization in this region. I made reference to the towns of Florence and Evansville. For anyone acquainted with O'odham history, you recognize these names as the beginning of our time of famine, as the beginning of when the settlers stole the Gila River from us and initiated this really grueling period in which we barely had any water rights at all. The person who brought this up, her name is Raylyn. I think her last name is Williams. Raylyn. She took particular issue with the reference to Florence. I think she understood that it was a historical reference. But the reason why she didn't like it is, as she pointed out, she said, the city of Florence has never acknowledged that they're on O'odham land. So I don't see why they should be in this statement. So even though I was not saying on behalf of Florence that they acknowledge they're an O'odham land, it still irritated Raylyn to see Florence's name mentioned in this statement. I guess she felt like Florence was benefiting unfairly from the Hurt Museum statement. I said, okay, I get what you're saying, so I'll rewrite that as well. The criticism that really took me by surprise, because the Hurt Museum and Phoenix, is home to Indigenous people from all over Arizona, all over North America, all over everywhere. I needed a phrase that encompassed all of those other Indigenous nations, right? Because there's a lot of Indigenous nations, represented in the Hurt's collection by itself. However, one of the THPOs, took umbrage, with the phrase Indigenous people, and wanted me desperately to get rid of that language. And I was just completely confused, because this person was expressing themselves in where he literally said, the Akimel O'odham are not Indigenous people. I'm like, what are you talking about? You're actually telling me that our own people are not Indigenous. He said, yes. And so it took some effort on my part to figure out what he was upset about. It turned out it was actually quite simple. It's not that the O'odham or any other Indigenous people are not Indigenous. What he was upset about was using Indigenous or Indigenous people as a synonym for American Indian or Native American. In other words, the way that he read the original statement, it was a misreading, misunderstanding, but the way he was reading that phrase, he was seeing it as a substitute for saying Akimel O'odham. You should say Akimel O'odham. And so when I realized what was going on, I was able to clarify for him what the distinction was in the language that we were using, in our statement. Still, I had to make a revision, which is reflected in the draft that we have now. And so this whole process has been going on for a couple of years now. And so it's been quite a lot of effort and commitment on our part. And we're nearly done. I'm going to share with you, by way of concluding my presentation, the draft that we have. I need a sip of water first. The draft that I'm going to share with you, just take like a minute and a half to read. The draft that I'm going to share with you is not official yet. It's virtually official. There is a meeting of the HERDS Program Committee coming up in a few days, where there's going to be a final vote on the statement, which should be a formality. And then there's going to be a meeting of the HERD Board of Trustees on, I believe, the 18th, where the Board of Trustees will officially adopt the statement as the HERDS Land Acknowledgement Statement. So I need to make that perfectly clear. If I'm not mistaken, the director of the HERD Museum is in my audience, and so I want to make sure that I cross all my T's and dot all my I's with respect to the exact status of this document. But for your consideration, this is the draft that we came up with. Oops. I'm going to need to, so I can read this. There we go. If you'll indulge me for a moment, it states, the HERD Museum acknowledges that the land this institution has stood upon since 1929 is within the O'odham Jevet, which the Akimel O'odham have regarded as their homeland since time immemorial. Despite the land's annexation into New Spain, the Mexican Republic, and the United States, which assumed control after the 1854 Gadsden Purchase, the Akimel O'odham have consistently asserted that this land is theirs, as recounted in their creation story, in which Jevet Mackay, Earth Doctor, made this place. Today, the Akimel O'odham are part of the 4 Southern Tribes of Arizona, which is a coalition comprised of the Gila River Indian Community, the Salt River Pima Maricopa Indian Community, the Ak-Chin Indian Community, and the Tohono O'odham Nation. And then there's the second part, which consists of the HERD's aspirational goals. The HERD Museum, in what is today downtown Phoenix, Arizona, occupies land within sight of numerous Huagam or ancestral O'odham canals, farmlands, and villages, which is evidence of a presence going back countless generations, long before Father Eusebio Kino and the conquistador Juan Mateo Manhe arrived in the area on November 21st, 1697, which harbingered a succession of colonization. Indeed, the founders of the HERD Museum in particular benefited from the U.S. making Arizona a territory in 1863, then a state in 1912, which led to the economic development of Phoenix, which became an election precinct in 1868. Consequently, the HERD acknowledges that it has a moral obligation to the Akimel O'odham, on whose land this museum continues to thrive. The latter is in addition to the indigenous peoples from within and well beyond Arizona, currently inhabiting the greater Phoenix metropolitan area. With this in mind, the HERD proclaims that it remains dedicated to honoring its relationship with the Akimel O'odham through its programming, exhibits, public events, publications, and community service, which it extends to the other indigenous peoples represented in its collections. The HERD hereby proudly commits itself to a future of building, improving, and nurturing its relationships with the Akimel O'odham and other indigenous communities, locally, regionally, nationally, and internationally. And with that,